Julian fired me on his first day, the blue hydrangeas I brought still trembling in my hands. "Pack your drive, Evelyn. You're locked out." But 3 days ago I'd signed something he didn't know about, a cryptographic private key transfer that made me the real owner of Omnicore Tech. Next morning my assistant ran in, face pale. "Boss, you need to see what's happening." The petals of those blue hydrangeas were still shaking against my palms when Julian Vance looked straight through me from the head of the mahogany table and said those exact words. Wait, not Evelyn. My actual name, the one I'd carried for 42 years, the one compiled into the foundational architecture of this entire artificial intelligence empire, didn't matter enough for his Ivy League vocabulary to retain. For 15 years, my name was printed on every foundational patent, every enterprise contract, and every performance review that kept this multi-billion-dollar machine breathing. But to Julian, I was just legacy code, an outdated subroutine ready to be purged from the main branch. Around the executive boardroom table, 3 newly appointed board directors sat frozen under the stark, sterile lighting of our San Francisco headquarters. Nobody corrected him. Nobody defended me. They just stared. Some looked on with cheap corporate pity. Others wore the uncomfortable sweating relief of people grateful the firing squad had aimed at someone else today. I'd walked into that glass-walled room on the 50th floor, carrying those blue hydrangeas as a quiet welcome gesture, a symbolic bridge between the visionary legacy of our late founder Arthur Sterling and whatever commercialized future Julian was supposed to bring. It was meant to be a simple human protocol. Julian hadn't even glanced at the flowers before destroying my career. But here's the variable he failed to calculate. What nobody in that soundproofed room knew. 3 days earlier, inside a sterile room at Stanford Healthcare, while monitors beeped a slow, failing rhythm, I had pressed my thumb onto a biometric tablet. I had signed the definitive SEC paperwork that transferred 44% of Omnicore's total voting shares directly to me, combined with the 7% I'd meticulously accumulated through founder-level stock options since 2011. I held 51% total majority control. The company Julian thought he was inheriting from his venture capitalist backers was already entirely mine. The weight of Arthur's vintage mechanical wristwatch pressed against my left wrist beneath my blazer sleeve, ticking like a secret localized countdown timer. Julian thought he had executed a flawless boardroom coup. He had absolutely no idea the servers had already migrated, and the game had ended before he even booted up his presentation. Let me take you back to how this architecture really began. Not with my public execution on a grey Monday morning, but with the 15 years of relentless sacrifice that built the very floor we were standing on. The brutal, unglamorous years that taught me exactly what loyalty costs in Silicon Valley and what it is actually worth when the market crashes. I never imagined my existence would be measured by what I deleted from my life instead of what I coded into it. But that is exactly the transaction I made for over a decade at Omnicore Tech. I started in 2011 as a junior QA engineer, the ultimate invisible bottom feeder role, where your name is only mentioned if the system crashes catastrophically. Fresh out of Stanford with an advanced computer science degree and more naive ambition than common sense, I made a calculated choice. I would make myself an indispensable core architecture that no executive could ever deprecate. So I learned everything. Every microservice, every data pipeline, every fragile dependency in our neural network pipelines. I memorized vendor API limits and cloud server lease contracts. I knew the specific handles of server farm technicians in Dublin and Tokyo, people I had never met in person, but whose midnight panic attacks I shared via Slack. I studied our competitors' architecture blind spots until I could predict a system bottleneck 3/4 before it manifested in the financial reports. The Great Austin outage of 2016 should have been my terminal crash. A critical server migration failure threatened to permanently wipe the database of our largest enterprise clients, putting a $2 billion valuation at immediate risk. The senior VP of infrastructure at the time was already drafting his resignation and preparing to cut our losses. I was 32 years old, barely 5 years into the company, and I volunteered to fix the core repository myself. I spent 3 miserable weeks living inside a makeshift cot in our Texas data center. The air smelled of heavy industrial cooling fans, ozone, and 48-hour-old Thai takeout. I sat across from stubborn government compliance officials and aggressive enterprise security teams, writing custom patches and finding regulatory workarounds that senior architects insisted were mathematically impossible. I survived entirely on black espresso, cold adrenaline, and sheer, unadulterated stubbornness. We brought the core network back online 2 weeks ahead of the disaster mitigation schedule, saving Omnicore from public ruin. The day after I returned to California, Arthur Sterling called me into his penthouse office. He didn't offer a theatrical round of applause. Arthur rarely wasted energy on corporate theatre. Instead, he unstrapped his personal vintage mechanical watch, handed it to me, and said something that permanently rewrote my operating system. "Instincts without structure are just a gambling habit, Elena. This watch keeps perfect structural time. Wear it, and never let street wall change your frequency." That vintage watch became my talisman. I wore it to every major deployment, every high-stakes funding round, and every critical product launch. It was a constant tactile reminder that the legendary founder believed I was capable of scaling this empire. Within a year, Arthur promoted me to Chief Technology Officer. 2 years later, I was Chief Operating Officer, COO, occupying a corner suite on the 50th floor, overlooking the low fog rolling past the Golden Gate Bridge. I genuinely believed I was compiled into the company's permanent DNA. I didn't realize I was merely building a beautiful high-tech prison where the walls were made of personal sacrifice, and the doors could only be locked from the outside by the board of directors. The guilt of that realization still sits in my chest, like a corrupted, unerasable log file, a heavy, dense weight that never dissolves, never clears, just constantly burns through my system's resources. The data logs of my memory always return to a cold Tuesday afternoon in November 2021. I remember the exact timestamp because Tuesdays were dedicated to the global infrastructure budget reviews, and the cloud compute costs for our European expansion were already spiraling out of control. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a spreadsheet of server maintenance costs, when my personal phone buzzed. It was my mother. When I answered, her voice sounded thinned out, like data packets losing integrity over a poor connection stretched across a heavy silence she was desperately trying to conceal from me. "The oncology team just wants to run a few more localized scans, Elena," she said, her tone deliberately casual, mimicking the rhythm of someone discussing a routine oil change. "But I am completely certain it is a non-issue, sweetheart. You know how these modern medical networks operate. Better safe than sorry. Don't disrupt your schedule." I told her I would pack a bag and drive down to her house in Monterey that coming weekend. I meant it with every fiber of my being. But by Thursday morning, the Austin server cluster suffered a catastrophic database corruption. 400 corporate enterprise architectures were knocked offline in an instant. A legacy Tier 1 cloud provider was threatening to terminate our hosting agreement over a compliance dispute that no one else in the executive suite possessed the technical capability to resolve. We were staring down millions of dollars in contractual SLA penalties per hour if we couldn't deploy a hotfix before their hard Monday morning deadline. I booked a Friday afternoon flight to the Texas data center instead of driving south to my mother. I executed the classic corporate self-delusion. It was a temporary anomaly, just one weekend, just one critical patch. She was a resilient woman. She had always understood when the architecture of Omnicore demanded my absolute undivided presence. The comprehensive biopsy results came back online via the hospital portal on Sunday morning. Stage 4, small cell lung carcinoma, already aggressively metastasized into her skeletal structure. The lead oncologist gave her 3 months if the targeted therapies held maybe 4 if we were extraordinarily lucky. I frantically opened my calendar app to tear apart my schedule, but the Tokyo artificial intelligence acquisition negotiations were locked to begin exactly 2 weeks later. Arthur Sterling walked into my office, shutting the glass door behind him with that specific, heavy, deliberate look I had learned to fear, the expression that meant he needed me to sacrifice a piece of my humanity because nobody else could compile the deal. "Your mother raised an engineer who saves entire ecosystems, Elena," Arthur told me, placing his hand briefly on my shoulder. It was the absolute closest thing to maternal or paternal affection he had ever displayed in his 15 years of mentorship. "She would be profoundly proud of the perimeter you are holding. 400 tech companies still have their data intact because you flew into the storm and engineered a solution. That is your legacy." So I boarded the international flight to Japan. I sat in a soundproofed corporate boardroom in Roppongi, arguing architectural data terms in broken Japanese, supplemented by an expensive executive translator who chain-smoked through every 10-minute recess. I negotiated for 6 consecutive days, without a full night of sleep, rewriting the intellectual property clauses myself, and ultimately closed the Tokyo acquisition in exactly half the projected timeline. On the long flight back over the Pacific, watching the cloud cover from 30,000 feet, I actually felt a sick sense of professional accomplishment. I felt hyper-valuable. My mother passed away while my aircraft was somewhere over the international date line, per strict corporate security policy regarding proprietary cryptographic protocols. I had deactivated my personal cellular device for the duration of the international flight. When the wheels touched down at SFO and I powered the system back on the cellular network, hit me with 17 missed calls and a single low bitrate voicemail from my aunt. It is an audio file that still plays on an infinite loop in my head on the nights when sleep refuses to come. "She asked for you at the very end, Elena." My aunt's voice cracked through the cheap speaker. "She kept repeating your name, looking at the door. I told her your flight was landing soon. I'm so incredibly sorry, honey." I attended the funeral 3 days later in a small church outside Monterey. I wore a stark black designer blazer I had purchased from an automated luxury kiosk at the airport terminal because I literally hadn't possessed the time to drive to my apartment to retrieve my own clothes. I stood there accepting hollow condolences from tech neighbors and distant relatives who barely remembered my face, while a local pastor who had never met my mother delivered automated generic platitudes about her quiet kindness. I returned to the San Francisco headquarters the very next Monday morning at 6 a.m. When you have already sacrificed the only piece of your life that truly matters, you keep the engine running because stopping the machine means acknowledging the absolute void you left behind. And that acknowledgement would have corrupted my entire system beyond repair. Working alongside Arthur Sterling wasn't comparable to having a traditional corporate supervisor. It was more akin to serving a permanent digital crusade, an architecture larger than any individual human lifespan or quarterly earnings report. He was completely devoid of personal warmth. Warmth was an uncompilable concept in his operating model, but he possessed absolute unyielding consistency in a volatile Thung-Lung silicon ecosystem, where mercenary executives migrated between tech firms based on stock vesting schedules. Arthur was a monolithic monument. He was deeply principled in a way that felt increasingly ancient and rare. He had constructed omnicore tech through calculated systemic intelligence and brutal strategic risk-taking, completely independent of family wealth or country club connections. He valued absolute engineering results over social relationships and systemic loyalty over personal likability. I was the perfect subroutine for that executive philosophy. My daily routine became my entire human identity. Early mornings at the tech campus, before the automated climate control even adjusted the temperature. Late nights reviewing neural network training logs, while the nighttime cleaning crew vacuumed around my ergonomic desk. Weekends spent auditing cloud architecture expenditures and strategic engineering documents that most C-suite executives would have instantly delegated to an army of subordinate vice presidents. I lived in a functional, forgettable high-rise apartment chosen exclusively because its commute time to the office was under 10 minutes. My furniture was ordered online without a single thought toward aesthetics. I had an elite gym membership that renewed automatically every January, despite my access badge never registering a single entry. My personal life consisted entirely of politely declining blind dates arranged by well-meaning HR managers who openly worried that I was becoming completely isolated from the human species. My life was omnicore tech. For nearly 15 years, I genuinely believed that an optimized corporate structure could fill all the empty spaces where other human beings hosted families, deep friendships, and lives that existed outside the corporate firewall. Then, 3 years ago, Arthur started scheduling private calendar invites labeled succession planning. He was approaching his 75th year, his mind still as sharp as a diamond blade, but he was realistic about biological mortality, in a way that successful tech founders rarely are until the telemetry forces the conversation. I logically assumed the transition plan would promote from within the core engineering architecture someone who intimately understood the code, the cultural operating system, and the structural principles that had insulated Omnicore through multiple market corrections and dot-com upheavals. Then Julian Vance materialized. He was barely 30, with his Harvard degrees and venture capital pedigree displayed like composite armor plating. He possessed a ruthless financial efficiency wrapped inside perfectly tailored Italian suits and mathematically calculated smiles. Arthur brought him in as vice president of financial strategy and almost immediately began positioning him as the undisputed heir apparent to the kingdom. I buried my professional disappointment deep within my database. I forced myself to believe it made macroeconomic sense, fresh financial perspectives, new capital market energy for an evolving tech landscape. The enterprise needed to scale, not stagnate, under the same engineering leadership forever. But I began noticing the code anomalies. They were small microaggressions that accumulated like digital sediment at the bottom of a riverbed, slowly but permanently altering the entire flow of the company. I sat through budget meetings where Julian would openly challenge core engineering decisions that Arthur and I had codified years ago, suggesting aggressive short-term data monetization schemes that prioritized immediate quarterly revenue over long-term data security stability. I watched younger software managers gravitate toward his faux wall charisma, nodding their heads with sycophantic enthusiasm, as Julian dismissed decades of hard-earned institutional wisdom as legacy thinking that holds our valuation back from real growth. I watched Arthur grow increasingly silent during those high-stakes sessions. His once fearsome, razor-sharp rebuttals softened into tired, slow agreements. He was aging. His hardware was failing. Sometimes, when a meeting adjourned, I would catch Arthur staring at Julian with an unreadable, dark expression. It wasn't pride. It was a mixture of profound doubt, deep analytical regret, and something that looked terrifyingly close to raw fear. The transition of power at Omnicore didn't happen with a sudden boardroom coup. It crept in like a slow-acting malware script, quietly altering system permissions, while the core application appeared to run smoothly. Julian Vance didn't understand the code that kept our artificial intelligence models stable, but he understood the dark mechanics of corporate leverage with terrifying precision. Within 6 months of his arrival, he had managed to place his own loyalists from his former venture capital firm into critical mid-level management roles across our product development and corporate finance departments. He was systematically rewriting the company's organizational DNA from the inside out. I watched him do it powerless to intervene, without initiating a full-scale executive civil war that would have tanked our upcoming Series E funding round. I would sit across from him in our bi-weekly architecture reviews, watching his manicured fingers slide across his tablet, presenting slick, oversimplified slide decks that reduced 15 years of meticulous engineering into abstract metrics like user monetization velocity and data liquidity ratios. "Evelyn," he said to me during a particularly tense Q2 planning session, using that deliberately incorrect name he used as a passive-aggressive tool to diminish my authority. "Your infrastructure model is incredibly robust. No one is disputing that. But it's fundamentally conservative. We are sitting on petabytes of unstructured user interaction data that we are essentially treating as dead weight. If we open up our API endpoints to third-party marketing networks, we can unlock a 30% revenue lift within 45 days. Opening those specific endpoints violates our foundational data privacy architecture." "Julian," I replied, my voice flat, holding the steady rhythmic frequency of Arthur's vintage watch ticking against my wrist. "Our enterprise clients trust us because we do not commoditize their internal operational data. If we breach that perimeter, we aren't just breaking a software contract. We are destroying the core trust metric that allowed us to build this market share in the first place." Julian smiled, a hollow, practiced movement of facial muscles that didn't involve his eyes. "The market has evolved past sentimental architecture, Evelyn. Trust is a lagging indicator. Capital efficiency is what drives the current valuation." Arthur agrees with me. I turned my head sharply toward the head of the table. Arthur Sterling sat in his high-backed leather chair, his hands clasped over his stomach. The fierce, unyielding light that had defined his gaze for decades looked dim, like a failing monitor screen. He didn't look at me. He just nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on some distant point outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, watching the heavy afternoon fog roll across the Salesforce tower. "Let's run a limited pilot program in the European staging environment, Eleanor," Arthur said. His voice thinned by age and a quiet underlying fatigue I had never heard before. He had used my correct name, but the concession felt empty, almost pathetic. "Julian's team has done the predictive modeling. We need the capital infusion if we want to sustain our quantum computing research facility." That was the exact moment I realized the old guard had fallen. Arthur wasn't just aging, he was surrendering. The relentless pressure from the Wall Street activist investors Julian had brought to the table had broken the old man's resolve. Omnicore Tech was no longer an engineering fortress. It was being liquidated into a short-term cash machine for a group of 20-something venture capitalists who couldn't tell the difference between a neural network and a relational database. For the next 3 months, my role as Chief Operating Officer became an agonizing exercise in damage control. I spent 80 hours a week building architectural firewalls around our core algorithms, trying to isolate our primary proprietary software from the insecure, profit-driven third-party AP. Is that Julian's team was aggressively plugging into our network. It felt like trying to patch a leaking dam with digital duct tape, while the man standing next to you was actively drilling holes in the concrete to sell the water. My relationship with Arthur deteriorated into a professional ice age. He stopped inviting me to his penthouse suite for our late-night architectural deep dives. Our text threads, which used to be filled with complex system design debates at 2 a.m., fell completely silent. Whenever I tried to corner him in the executive lounge to show him the telemetry data, the rising error rates, the security vulnerabilities Julian's initiatives were introducing, he would simply wave his hand dismissively. "You're micromanaging the transition, Elena," he told me bluntly inside an elevator ride that felt colder than our Texas data center storage rooms. "Julian is the future of this enterprise's market capitalization. You need to learn to build alongside his vision, or you are going to find yourself outside the system architecture looking in." The warning was clear, but my operating system wasn't programmed for compliance. It was programmed for stability, for truth, for the preservation of the machine we had built out of raw logic and human sacrifice. I couldn't just stand by and watch them burn down the infrastructure I had given up my mother's final moments to protect. I began compiling my own quiet telemetry, working from a secure encrypted terminal in my apartment late at night, completely detached from the Omnicore corporate network. I began auditing the financial transactions Julian's venture capital group was executing. I tracked the shell companies they were setting up in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, mapping the flow of intellectual property licenses they were quietly preparing to spin off from the parent company. Julian wasn't just planning to run Omnicore. He was preparing a systematic corporate asset stripping operation. He was going to inflate our valuation for an initial public offering, dump his shares at the peak, and leave an empty, unstable shell of a software company to collapse on the retail investors. The scale of the betrayal was staggering, but I lacked the voting power to stop it. The board of directors was already bought and paid for by Julian's backers. Arthur held 44% of the shares, but he had legally signed over his voting proxy to Julian for the upcoming fiscal year, believing the young executive would protect his legacy. I was isolated, holding a measly 7% of founder-level stock options, a fly on the windshield of a speeding corporate freight train. Then came the night that changed everything. The night the universe forced me to decide whether I was an engineer who merely observed the system or an operator willing to rewrite the host file itself. It started with a midnight medical alert from Arthur's private security detail. The midnight alert from Arthur's security detail wasn't a standard corporate notification. It bypassed my phone's emergency override protocols, flashing a stark, amber diagnostic code across my terminal screen: Medical Priority 0. Stanford Healthcare. My fingers froze over my keyboard. The encrypted transaction ledger I had been auditing vanished into the background. I didn't breathe. I just grabbed Arthur's vintage wristwatch from my desk, strapped it to my wrist, and ran out into the damp, foggy San Francisco night. The drive down the peninsula via Interstate 101 was a blur of taillights and rain-slicked asphalt. When I burst through the double doors of the intensive care unit on the 4th floor, the sterile, high-tech environment felt terrifyingly familiar. The rhythmic, artificial beep of life support monitors echoed through the corridor. The exact soundscape that had played during my mother's final hours while I was across the Pacific, pretending that a corporate acquisition could outvalue a human life. I found Arthur, hooked up to an array of complex medical machinery, looking incredibly small beneath the heavy hospital linens. His skin was the color of faded parchment, but when his eyes mapped my entrance, the dimming light I had seen in the boardroom suddenly flared with an intense, concentrated desperation. Julian Vance was already standing on the opposite side of the bed, his designer trench coat draped over a plastic visitor's chair. He was huddled with 2 corporate attorneys from his venture capital firm, their voices hushed but rapid, speaking in the hurried cadences of engineers rushing to patch a critical code exploit before the markets opened. "He shouldn't even be conscious, Evelyn," Julian murmured as I approached, his voice laced with an uncharacteristic undercurrent of panic. He didn't even look up from his tablet. His vascular system suffered a catastrophic rupture 2 hours ago. The medical team is stabilizing him for emergency surgery, but the board needs to execute the permanent emergency succession proxy immediately. If the market opens on Monday without a definitive CEO transition signature, our valuation drops 40% by the opening bell. "Get your lawyers out of this room, Julian," I said, my voice dropping into a low, lethal frequency that halted the attorneys mid-sentence. "He is under heavy sedation, and he does not possess the cognitive capacity to execute an emergency corporate restructuring while hooked up to a ventilator." Julian finally raised his eyes, his practiced street wall smile entirely absent, replaced by a cold, transactional sneer. "The board has already voted, Evelyn. We don't require your operational validation. Arthur signed the intent of transfer framework last quarter. We are simply compiling the final executable code." "Step back, Julian," A voice rasped from the bed. It was Arthur. The voice was thinned out barely a whisper through the oxygen mask, but it carried the absolute weight of a man who had built a $40 billion empire out of nothing but raw logic and stubbornness. He weakly waved his left hand, dismissing Julian and his legal team toward the far corner of the sterile room. "Leave the room, all of you. I need to review the operational telemetry with my chief operating officer." Julian's jaw clenched so tight, I could see the muscle jumping beneath his manicured stubble. He opened his mouth to object, but one of his attorneys caught his sleeve, whispering a warning about medical capacity litigation. With a sharp, hostile nod, Julian gathered his devices and marched out into the corridor, his team trailing behind him like shadow processes. The heavy glass door clicked shut, leaving only the mechanical hum of the hospital room. I moved to Arthur's side, taking his frail hand in mine. His grip was surprisingly cold, his fingers tracing the metallic contours of the vintage watch I wore on my wrist. "I let the system get corrupted, Eleanor," he whispered, coughing weakly as a red diagnostic line flashed on the monitor above his head. "I trusted the financial modeling. I thought Julian was the infrastructure we needed to scale into the next decade, but I audited the dark pool transaction logs last week. He's going to strip the intellectual property. He's going to liquidate Omnicore and sell our proprietary AI modules to a defense conglomerate in Virginia." "I know Arthur," I said softly, leaning closer. "I tracked the shell companies in Delaware. I have the entire forensic ledger saved on an air-gapped drive. He thinks he's already executed the main script." Arthur rasped, a faint, terrifyingly brilliant smile breaking through his exhaustion. "He thinks my nephew Chloe is going to sell him the remaining family shares the moment my heart stops beating. But Julian fails to realize that I designed the original kernel of this company. I always build a back door into the security architecture." He reached beneath his pillow and withdrew a matte black biometric hospital tablet, its screen already glowing with a dense, unformatted legal document from the Securities and Exchange Commission. "This is a definitive, unrevocable stock transfer agreement," Arthur said, his voice gaining a sudden, desperate momentum. 44% of Omnicore Tech's total voting shares transferred directly from my private trust to your personal portfolio, effective exactly 72 hours after my biological termination. It's a delayed cron job, Eleanor. By Friday morning, the SEC Public Registry will update automatically. My breath caught in my throat. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Arthur. 44%. With my founder options that gives me 51% total majority control, the board will fight this. Julian will tie this up in federal court for years. "They won't fight what they don't see coming," Arthur whispered, his eyes locking onto mine with the absolute terrifying intensity of a master strategist. "This is your final systemic test, Elena. Do not reveal the transfer code on Monday. Let Julian execute his purge. Let him think he has achieved absolute victory. Let the board members expose their true loyalties and sign their names to his liquidation paperwork. Let them reveal exactly who they are when they believe you are completely powerless." He paused, his oxygen levels dipping dangerously on the monitor telemetry. He forced himself to continue, his cold fingers tightening around my wrist. "Because that is when human code reveals its true vulnerabilities. Not under active scrutiny, but in the moments when they believe nobody is tracking the logs. And when they have signed everything, when they have exposed every corrupt dependency. You deploy the patch. You reclaim the architecture. Not out of vengeance, but because you are the only entity left who understands what this machine cost to build." Before I could answer, the intensive care alarms began to blare a continuous high-pitched warning. A team of cardiac surgeons threw open the glass doors, pushing me back from the bedside as Arthur's vital signs plummeted into a terminal spiral. As they wheeled him toward the operating theatre, his eyes remained fixed on me through the crowd of medical staff. I stood alone in the empty, sterile room, my hand resting on the vintage watch, holding a biometric tablet that contained the cryptographic keys to a multi-billion-dollar empire that didn't yet know I was its absolute owner. The countdown had officially begun. Arthur Sterling survived the emergency vascular surgery, but he never returned to the 50th floor. He drifted into a medically induced coma, a silent static monument hooked up to advanced life support telemetry at Stanford. To the public, he was an aging titan fading gracefully into the background. To Wall Street, his silence was a green light. To Julian Vance, it was the definitive deletion of the only firewall that stood between him and total systemic liquidation. On Monday morning, precisely 72 hours before the cryptographic SEC transfer cron job was scheduled to execute, I walked into the San Francisco headquarters at my usual time, 5:45 a.m. The glass-walled campus was eerily quiet. The automated climate control hummed a low mechanical drone circulating cold air through the empty corridors. When my keycard scanned at the executive elevator bank, the peripheral security terminal flashed a non-standard amber warning code: access pending executive review required. My stomach dropped into a cold, hollow void, but my facial muscles didn't flinch. I held the steady, rhythmic frequency of Arthur's watch against my wrist. I knew exactly what that amber code meant. Julian was already compiling his purge script. He was testing the digital perimeter, revoking my system privileges, one microservice at a time, before delivering the terminal blow in the boardroom. By 9 a.m., the 50th floor boardroom was packed with the newly appointed board directors. Their faces tense, huddled over expensive catering coffee and encrypted tablets. Julian sat at the head of the mahogany table, occupying Arthur's vacant leather chair. He had already shed his casual Silicon Valley tech apparel. Today he wore a razor-sharp bespoke charcoal suit from Savile Row. He looked less like a technology chief executive and more like a high-yield bankruptcy liquidator preparing to dissect a fallen asset. "Evelyn," Julian said, as I took my seat at the far end of the table, his voice carrying an exaggerated performative layer of corporate empathy. "Thank you for joining us on such short notice. Given Arthur's tragic medical trajectory, the board has been working around the clock to stabilize our market capitalization. We've finalized the restructuring documentation for our Series E extension." I leaned back, folding my hands over my lap, deliberately concealing the biometric tablet resting inside my leather portfolio. "I reviewed the updated agenda you uploaded to the registry, Julian. You aren't just extending the funding round. You are moving to license our core proprietary neural network models to an external holding entity called Apex Sentinel LLC, based in McLean, Virginia." A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the boardroom. Several directors suddenly found the details of their digital spreadsheets deeply fascinating, refusing to meet my gaze. "Apex Sentinel is a specialized strategic partner, Evelyn," Julian replied smoothly, his eyes narrowing into cold, predatory slits. "They possess deep-tier distribution channels within the public sector that Omnicore cannot replicate independently. It's an optimized asset allocation strategy. It maximizes our immediate liquidity." "It's an asset stripping operation," I corrected him. My voice completely flat, devoid of anger, mimicking the sterile precision of an automated debugger. "Apex Sentinel is a shell company funded entirely by the same venture capital consortium that backed your appointment here. You are transferring our primary intellectual property, 15 years of foundational artificial intelligence research, to a private entity you control, effectively bankrupting the parent company before the public offering." Julian's smile didn't just vanish. It evaporated into a hard, aggressive sneer. He leaned forward, slamming both palms flat against the polished mahogany surface. "Even if that were true, Evelyn, what are you going to do about it?" he whispered, his voice cutting through the silent room like a scalpel. "Look around this table. The board has already executed the written consent framework. We hold 65% of the current voting bloc, including Arthur's proxy, which legally transferred to my administration the moment he was incapacitated. You hold 7%. You are an incredibly talented legacy engineer, but you are mathematically irrelevant to the future of this enterprise. He reached down, tapping his tablet with a sharp, definitive stroke. As of 9:15 a.m., the board has voted to deprecate the role of Chief Operating Officer. Julian announced, his voice echoing with triumphant finality. Your employment agreement with Omnicore Tech is officially terminated for strategic misalignment. Security is currently wiping your corporate credentials from the Active Directory. Your administrative access to our GitHub repositories, our cloud server infrastructure, and our internal communication channels has been permanently revoked. You have exactly 20 minutes to clear your desk and exit the perimeter. I watched him execute the execution script. I watched the directors nod in automated unison, signing their digital signatures to the official termination ledger, completely oblivious to the fact that they were writing their own professional death warrants. They were documenting their complicity in a fraudulent corporate asset transfer, logging their names indelibly into the legal timeline. 20 minutes is more than enough time, Julian, I said softly. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten litigation. I simply stood up, zipped my leather portfolio, and walked out of the glass boardroom. As I walked down the long corridor toward my corner suite, the digital lights on my smart terminal began to flicker and die. My internal Slack connection logged out with a soft, synthetic chime. My enterprise email client flashed a stark red notification. Account deactivated. They were locking the doors behind me, purging my presence from the digital ecosystem I had spent my entire adult life constructing. My assistant, Kylie, met me at my office door, her face completely pale, her fingers trembling as she handed me a cardboard archive box. Elena, I'm so incredibly sorry. They didn't even let me archive your historical engineering logs. The IT infrastructure team just locked the entire directory from the central server room. It's all right, Kylie, I whispered, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I reached down into the box and carefully placed the blue hydrangeas I had brought earlier on top of my personal notebooks. The system is just running a scheduled maintenance cycle. Pack your files and go home for the week. Take some paid time off. But what about Julian? She asked, her voice cracking with genuine fear for the company's future. He's calling an all-hands meeting for Friday morning to announce the restructuring. I smiled, a genuine dark flash of anticipation warming my chest for the first time in months. I checked Arthur's vintage watch. The countdown timer was at exactly 72 hours. The cryptographic cron job was sitting silently in the SEC public registry queue, completely invisible to Julian's sophisticated threat models. Let him call the meeting, Kylie, I said, picking up the archive box and walking toward the exit elevators. Friday morning is exactly when the system patch goes live. The 72 hours following my public termination were the quietest minutes of my entire life. For 15 years, my biological rhythm had been completely tethered to the relentless high-frequency data streams of Omnicore Tech. Now, sitting inside my dark apartment overlooking the grey fog of the bay, my personal terminal remained air-gapped, detached from the corporate matrix. I spent those 3 days running internal diagnostics on my own choices, staring at the vintage mechanical watch on my wrist. Its rhythmic physical ticking was the only system log that mattered now. Julian Vance spent those same 72 hours celebrating his absolute victory. Through the public tech news channels, I watched him aggressively seed the narrative of his new regime. Press releases filled the feeds of tech publications announcing a streamlined corporate evolution and an aggressive modernization strategy designed to unlock latent asset value. He was already framing the liquidation of our core AI models to Apex Sentinel as a brilliant, forward-thinking strategic partnership. He didn't realize that in the architecture of systemic warfare, the most dangerous vulnerability isn't a weak firewall or a compromised cryptographic key. It is the absolute arrogance of an operator who believes he has already won the game. Julian's sophisticated threat models were designed to detect legal injunctions, insider leaks, or hostile board maneuvers. He was completely blind to a quiet, scheduled cron job sitting deep within the automated SEC public registry queue, a digital ghost waiting for its timestamp to match the system clock. On Friday morning, at exactly 8:30 a.m., the official Omnicore all-hands notification hit the public airwaves. Julian had summoned all 800 San Francisco employees, along with the global engineering teams, streaming via secure link to the central atrium on the ground floor. It was designed to be his coronation ceremony, the public demonstration of his undisputed ownership. I arrived at the headquarters at 8:45 a.m. I didn't carry an archive box this time. I wore a tailored midnight black structured suit, my hair pulled back into a severe professional knot. As I stepped through the glass revolving doors, two private security contractors in tactical corporate uniforms immediately moved to intercept me, their hands hovering near their communications earpieces. Near Ms. Vance, the lead guard said, using the incorrect name Julian had codified into the security log. Your credentials have been permanently revoked. You are restricted from entering the perimeter. Check the SEC public registry interface on your terminal officer, I said, my voice carrying the dead, unshakable frequency of a system administrator executing a forced override. The automated registration system updated exactly 15 minutes ago at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. My legal name is Elena Vance, and I hold 51% total majority voting control of Omnicore Tech. As the primary shareholder and controlling owner of this property, I am instructing you to step aside, or you will be trespassed from my building by the San Francisco Police Department. The guard's brow furrowed. He pulled out his company-issued tablet, his fingers flying across the corporate compliance database. I watched the exact millisecond the data packet synchronized. His face went completely bloodless, his eyes widening as the system privileges refreshed, displaying my name in bold, unerasable gold text at the absolute top of the corporate hierarchy chart. He slowly stepped backward, bowing his head in an awkward, terrified gesture of submission. My apologies, Ms. Vance, he stammered. The directory, it just updated. I know, I replied smoothly, walking past him toward the executive elevator bank. The patch is live. The central atrium was a massive 4-story glass amphitheater packed with hundreds of employees standing in tense, anxious clusters. Giant LED screens hung from the exposed steel architectural beams, displaying a massive presentation slide that read, Omnicore next scaling the frontier of efficiency. Julian stood on the raised central stage, a wireless microphone clipped to his lapel, his hands gesturing expansively as he addressed the silent crowd. The board of directors sat in a semicircle of designer chairs directly behind him, wearing the smug, self-satisfied expressions of politicians who had successfully executed a quiet coup. And this strategic reorganization allows us to offload the heavy infrastructure costs of our legacy development cycles. Julian's voice echoed through the high-end sound system, filled with that polished, toxic Wall Street charisma. By licensing our core assets to Apex Sentinel, we ensure a leaner, more agile capitalization structure that positions us perfectly for our upcoming public debut. This is the future of Silicon Valley engineering, and I am proud to lead. You aren't leading anything, Julian. My voice cut through the auditorium, amplified by the natural acoustics of the glass atrium as I walked down the central concrete staircase. The entire crowd of 800 people turned simultaneously, a collective audible gasp, rippling through the room like a sudden server spike. Julian froze mid-sentence, his microphone picking up the sharp, ragged catch in his breath. His eyes locked onto mine, his face instantly contorting into a mask of pure corporate fury. "Security!" Julian barked into his microphone, his polished veneer cracking completely. "Remove her immediately. Evelyn was terminated for cause on Tuesday. She is trespassing on corporate property." Nobody moved. The security guards standing at the perimeter of the stage kept their hands clasped firmly in front of them, their eyes fixed straight ahead, completely unresponsive to his commands. "The guards aren't going to help you, Julian," I said, stepping onto the edge of the stage, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood platform. I pulled the biometric tablet from my blazer and tapped the screen wirelessly, casting the active document directly onto the giant LED screens towering above us. The presentation slide vanished, replaced instantly by an official certified SEC Form 4 document bearing the digital seal of the United States government. At the bottom of the document, Arthur Sterling's validated biometric signature sat alongside mine, stamped with an immutable cryptographic timestamp from 3 days ago. "Arthur Sterling didn't sign an emergency succession proxy to you," I announced to the entire room, my voice steady carrying across the silent crowd. 3 days ago at Stanford Healthcare, he executed an unrevocable transfer of his entire 44% voting block directly to my private trust. Combined with my 7% founder options, I hold 51% majority ownership of this company. Julian spun around to face the board of directors, his hands shaking as he pointed at the screen. "This is a fraudulent document. It's a desperate legal stunt. The board has already executed the written consent framework. My proxy is legally binding." The lead corporate attorney, who had been sitting with Julian on Tuesday night, slowly stood up from the front row, his eyes glued to his personal device. He looked up at Julian, his face completely pale, his hands trembling. "It's real, Julian," the lawyer whispered, his voice picking up on the stage microphones. "The SEC public ledger updated 15 minutes ago. The transfer architecture is completely ironclad. Her voting power supersedes the board's proxy. She owns the company." Julian's face went through a brutal, multi-stage transition. The polished faux wall bronze faded into a sickening ash-grey hue, his eyes darting frantically between the massive LED screens and the silent corporate attorney who had just shattered his reality. The wireless microphone in his hand picked up the sharp, shallow rhythm of his breathing, broadcasting his panic to the 800 employees staring down from the 4 tiers of the glass atrium. "This is a contractual anomaly," Julian stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to force his signature confident smile back onto his face. He stepped toward me, dropping his hand to lower the microphone, trying to internalize the crisis before it leaked further into the crowd. "Elena, listen to me. We are in the middle of a highly sensitive capitalization cycle. Whatever personal grievance you have regarding your operational termination, we can litigate it privately in executive mediation. You are jeopardizing a $40 billion valuation." "I am not litigating a grievance, Julian. I am managing my asset," I said, my voice cutting through his attempt at damage control with the unyielding precision of an automated kernel override. I didn't lower my microphone. I wanted every engineer, every data scientist, and every desktop support technician in the building to hear the exact terms of the deletion. I stepped to the center of the stage, turning my back on Julian to face the board of directors. The 3 newly appointed venture capital representatives looked like they were sitting in a failing aircraft, their fingers flying across their devices as they desperately tried to ping their offshore legal teams. "Gentlemen," I addressed them, my eyes locking onto the lead director who had sat in smug silence during my execution on Tuesday. On Monday morning, this board executed a written consent framework authorizing the transfer of OmniCore core proprietary neural network models to an external entity called Apex Sentinel LLC. You signed that ledger knowing it would strip the parent company of its primary value, intending to leave an empty, unstable shell for public retail investors. That was a valid commercial licensing agreement. The lead director shouted, his voice defensive, echoing poorly through the massive open space. It was fully vetted by our financial strategy committee. It was a fraudulent asset stripping operation funded by a shell consortium you control. I corrected him, tapping my tablet to refresh the screen behind us. The SEC filing slid aside, replaced by the forensic financial ledger I had compiled from my air-gapped terminal. The Delaware registration details, the Cayman Island banking routing codes, and the precise transaction logs, matching their digital signatures, flashed in massive, unerasable gold font above their heads. A collective low murmur rolled through the hundreds of employees in the atrium. The engineering teams, the people who had given up their nights and weekends to code those neural networks, were staring at the exact data showing how their life's work was about to be stolen and sold for a private street wall payout. As the majority shareholder, holding 51% of the total voting power of this enterprise, I am exercising my structural override. I announced each word, falling like a line of terminal code. Effective immediately, the board of directors is dissolved. Your administrative seats are revoked. Your company-issued devices are bricked, and your access to our corporate network is permanently terminated. You have 10 minutes to exit the perimeter before building security escorts you out in front of the local news networks. The lead director opened his mouth to scream a threat about shareholder lawsuits, but his tablet suddenly flashed a stark red screen. Credential terminated. Device remote. Wiped by corporate administrator. He stared at the blank glass screen in his hand, a look of pure, unadulterated shock crossing his features. One by one, the other two directors looked down as their phones and tablets died in unison. They stood up, their designer suits suddenly looking fragile and absurd under the sterile industrial lighting of the atrium, and shuffled off the stage in complete humiliated silence. Julian was left standing alone at the edge of the platform, the wireless microphone trembling visibly in his grip. The arrogant, predatory executive who had told me just 3 days ago that I was dead weight and mathematically irrelevant looked completely hollowed out, stripped of the venture capital infrastructure that had given him his artificial authority. You can't operate this company without the capital markets, Elena, Julian whispered, a desperate last-ditch venom spitting from his lips. He stepped closer, his eyes bloodshot. The Series E extension is dead the moment I walk out that door. The activist investors will short this stock into oblivion before the opening bell on Friday. You might own 51% of the architecture, but I will make sure you own 51% of a bankrupt crater. The capital markets didn't write the core codebase of this company, Julian, I said, looking down at Arthur's vintage mechanical watch on my wrist. Its physical, steady ticking felt like a heartbeat reclaiming the system. And you vastly underestimate the value of an intact infrastructure. I turned away from him, looking out at the 800 faces staring down from the balconies. I saw Kylie standing near the front row, her tears gone, replaced by a fierce, burning pride. I saw the senior engineering leads, the QA technicians, the database administrators, the invisible essential components of the machine. I had scaled alongside Arthur Sterling for 15 years. Julian Vance's employment as Chief Executive Officer is terminated for material breach of fiduciary duty, effective immediately, I announced to the room, my voice expanding through the sound system. His security privileges are permanently deleted. His access to the main branch is revoked. 2 of our internal security team members, men who had known me since I was a 29-year-old engineer surviving on black coffee in the Austin data center, stepped onto the stage. They didn't look at Julian's expensive Savile Row suit. They didn't wait for his authorization. They simply flanked him, their expressions completely neutral, and pointed toward the exit doors. "This way, Mr. Vance," the lead guard said, Julian looked at the guards, then back at the screens, displaying his financial treason, and finally at the hundreds of employees who were now staring at him with absolute unyielding coldness. He didn't say another word. He dropped his wireless microphone onto the hardwood floor, the plastic casing cracking with a sharp, distorted pop, and walked off the stage, escorted out of the empire he thought he had conquered. The silence that followed the plastic crack of Julian's dropped microphone was heavier than any server room blackout. For several seconds, 800 human beings stood entirely motionless inside the glass-walled amphitheater, their collective gaze shifting from the empty exit doors back to the center of the stage where I stood alone. The golden data logs of the board's financial treason still glowed on the massive LED screens above me, casting a harsh amber light across the concrete floor. I looked down at the microphone rolling slowly near my heels. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need the artificial amplification anymore. The structural architecture of the company had already synchronized with my frequency. Kylie! I called out, my voice cutting through the damp, quiet air of the atrium. My assistant stepped forward from the front row. Her shoulders squared her tablet, already booted into an administrative shell. The young engineer who had been handed a cardboard archive box to facilitate my erasure on Tuesday was now looking at me like a core processor, awaiting an executive instruction. Reinitialize the central infrastructure repository. I commanded my words, echoing clearly through the glass tiers. Reinstate every internal software engineer, QA technician, and systems administrator whose access was revoked under the Vance administration over the past 90 days. Restore their full administrative permissions to the primary deployment branch. Kylie's fingers flew across her biometric interface, her tablet emitting a sharp, rhythmic series of confirmation chimes. System permissions rolling back now, Elena. Main Active Directory is repopulating. Across the 4 floors of balconies, cellular devices and corporate terminals suddenly began buzzing in rapid overlapping succession. I watched senior engineers pull their devices from their pockets, their eyes widening as their administrative terminals flashed from red restriction screens back to full, unrestricted green access bars. The internal communication servers came roaring back to life, and the corporate firewalls I had spent 15 years building automatically slammed shut against external marketing API endpoints Julian had illegally plugged into our network. I turned my attention to the remaining department heads, standing near the base of the stage. The marketing vice presidents, the public relations leads, and the legal compliance officers, who had spent the last 72 hours drafting press releases to validate Julian's corporate heist. They stood paralyzed, their faces pale, holding their breath like users waiting to see if a system crash would corrupt their personal user profiles. To the remaining administrative leadership, I said, looking directly into the eyes of the chief financial officer who had sat complicit at Julian's right hand. Your operational metrics will undergo a complete forensic audit by an independent third-party entity starting at 10 a.m. today. Anyone who signed, authorized, or facilitated the transfer of our proprietary AI models to Apex Sentinel will have their corporate equity frozen and their employment terminated for material breach of fiduciary duty by the end of the business day. The CFO didn't object. He simply nodded once. A terrified, jerky motion of his head, turned on his heel and walked rapidly back toward the elevators to attempt to secure his personal legal representation. The rest of you, I addressed the massive crowd of engineers and developers looking down from the glass railings. Go back to your stations. Boot up your local repositories. We have a massive technical debt to clear, and our server optimization logs in Europe are flashing red. Let's get back to writing clean code. A sudden, deafening wave of applause broke through the atrium. Not the polite, performative clapping of a corporate shareholder meeting, but the raw, unadulterated roar of an engineering crew that had just been rescued from a catastrophic shipwreck. It was the sound of omnicore tech reclaiming its identity from street wall. As the crowd began to disperse into the elevator banks, discussing system parameters and database rollbacks in rapid, energized cadences, I stepped off the stage and walked toward the private executive lounge behind the amphitheater. The adrenaline that had sustained me since my midnight drive to Stanford Healthcare was beginning to drain from my system, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion that settled directly into my bones. I sat down on a stark, minimalist leather couch, resting my elbows on my knees, my eyes tracking the sweeping second hand of Arthur's vintage mechanical watch. It was 9:15 a.m. The entire corporate coup had been dismantled, passed, and deleted in exactly 45 minutes. The glass door of the lounge opened with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Kylie stepped inside carrying a fresh mug of black espresso and a secure, encrypted hardware token. Her face was no longer pale. She looked like an engineer who had just survived her first major production deployment. The SEC Public Registry has fully indexed the share transfer. Elena, she said softly, setting the espresso on the glass coffee table. The financial markets are reacting exactly as Julian predicted. The activist short sellers are hammering the pre-market valuation. We've dropped 7% since the announcement hit the wire. Let them short it, I replied, taking a slow sip of the bitter coffee, the warmth grounding my frayed nerves. The valuation Julian built was an artificial bubble inflated by stolen intellectual property and short-term optimization metrics. We are going to build our capitalization back up the same way Arthur and I did in 2011 through unassailable engineering and enterprise trust. And Arthur? Kylie asked, her voice dropping into a quiet, respectful register. The hospital called while you were on stage. The surgical team stabilized his vascular vitals, but the neurology department says his brain activity is running on a very low flat frequency. They don't know if he will ever boot back up. My throat tightened painfully, the ghost of my mother's hospital room flashing across my vision for a brief, agonizing second. I reached down my fingers, tracing the cold silver casing of the vintage watch against my skin. Arthur had given me his empire, but he had given it to me from the edge of the grave, leaving me to hold the perimeter entirely alone. He left the architecture in safe hands. Kylie, I whispered, forcing the emotional static out of my voice. That's all he cared about. I stood up, smoothing the front of my black blazer, and picked up the secure hardware token from the table. The public execution was over. The corporate raiders had been purged from the Active Directory. But the system was still fragile. The code was still bleeding. And I had a multi-billion-dollar artificial intelligence empire to rebuild from the foundational kernel up. By 6 p.m. on Friday evening, the frantic, high-frequency panic that had gripped the Omnicore Tech campus since Monday morning had flattened into a steady, rhythmic hum. The market closed with our valuation down 11%, a staggering multi-billion-dollar paper loss that would have caused any traditional Wall Street chief executive to suffer a catastrophic nervous breakdown. But on the 50th floor, inside the glass-walled command center, overlooking the dark, fog-shrouded waters of San Francisco Bay, we weren't looking at stock tickers. We were looking at code repositories. I stood before the primary holographic architecture array, the vintage mechanical watch on my left wrist, ticking its sharp physical cadence against the soft electronic hum of the servers. "Evelyn, sorry, Eleanor," a voice corrected itself near the doorway. I turned my head to see Mark Vance, our senior principal architect, and one of the original 5 engineers who had helped me patch the Great Austin outage back in 2016. He looked exhausted, his grey-streaked hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot behind his thick-rimmed glasses. But beneath the fatigue, there was a profound, quiet alignment in his posture that I hadn't seen since Julian Vance first stepped onto our campus. "We've completed the forensic integrity scan on our primary neural network branches, Elena," Mark said, tapping his tablet to sync his local diagnostic logs with the main display. Julian's team was further along than we calculated. They had already compiled a shadow release branch hidden beneath 3 layers of administrative encryption designed to automatically siphon our proprietary natural language models to the Apex Sentinel servers the moment the closing bell rang today. Did they execute the transfer script? I asked, my voice falling into that flat, lethal frequency of a system administrator auditing a critical breach. No, Mark replied, a fierce, tired smile breaking through his exhaustion. Your automated infrastructure patch caught it at the root directory. The moment the SEC registry synchronized your 51% ownership at 8:30 a.m., the corporate firewall recognized their external API tokens as unauthorized malware. The system didn't just halt the data migration, it triggered a full-scale kernel lock. It isolated their shadow branch and dumped their entire transaction log into our compliance folder. I leaned forward, my fingers sliding across the glass console to expand the forensic file. There they were, hundreds of lines of malicious corporate code signed with the digital credentials of Julian Vance, and the dissolved board members explicitly detailing the systematic theft of our life's work. It was the definitive, unrevocable evidence that would turn Julian's ambition into a federal grand jury indictment before the upcoming fiscal quarter. Purge the shadow branch completely, Mark. I commanded, my words falling with absolute finality. Run a full system wipe on every device assigned to Julian's Financial Strategy Committee. I don't want a single byte of their mercenary architecture remaining in our ecosystem. Consider it deleted, Mark said, his fingers striking his interface with an aggressive, satisfying clack. What about our European staging environment? The performance latency is still tracking outside our standard SLA parameters. I'll handle the European optimization loop myself tonight, I said, softly picking up my fresh mug of black espresso. Go home, Mark. Tell the infrastructure team to log off. They've held the perimeter perfectly today. I'll run the midnight maintenance cycle alone. Mark hesitated, looking at the empty leather chair at the head of the mahogany conference table, the chair that had belonged to Arthur Sterling for 15 years and which Julian Vance had occupied for less than a week. You shouldn't have to carry the entire weight of this machine by yourself, Eleanor. You've been running on adrenaline since Tuesday. I'm not alone, Mark, I said, my eyes dropping to the vintage watch on my wrist, its silver casing catching the harsh neon glow of the server monitors. I'm exactly where I compile best. With a respectful nod, Mark logged out of his terminal, grabbed his jacket, and exited the command center, the pneumatic glass doors sliding shut behind him with a soft, airtight hiss. The silence that followed was absolute. The deep industrial stillness that only exists inside a high-tech fortress when the human noise has been passed out of the architecture. I walked out of the command center and stepped into Arthur's vacant penthouse office at the far end of the executive suite. The room had been thoroughly stripped of Julian's expensive Italian leather portfolios and Wall Street trophies. Only the minimalist mahogany desk and the panoramic view of the Silicon Valley fog remained. I sat down in Arthur's chair, the heavy leather conforming to my posture, and opened my private air-gapped terminal. Before I initialized the European optimization scripts, I pulled up the real-time biometric telemetry feed from Stanford Healthcare. On the left side of my screen, a steady, rhythmic blue line tracked Arthur's vital statistics. His vascular system was completely stable, but his neural activity remained locked in that low, flat frequency. A biological system running a background standby loop, completely detached from the primary application of life. I stared at the flat line of his consciousness, a heavy, suffocating wave of grief finally breaking through the analytical firewalls I had maintained all day. I remembered my mother's final voicemail, the thinned-out frequency of her voice, and the absolute void she had left behind, while I was busy saving an infrastructure that didn't even know my real name. I had sacrificed my family for Arthur's vision, and then I had sacrificed my stability to protect his legacy from Julian's raiders. The transaction was complete. The system was secure. But the cost of the deployment was written indelibly into my own internal ledger. A permanent, unerasable technical debt that no amount of market capitalization could ever balance out. I reached down, unstrapped Arthur's vintage mechanical watch from my wrist, and set it carefully down on the center of the mahogany desk. Its physical metallic ticking echoed softly against the glass walls, a quiet, stubborn ghost inside the multi-billion-dollar digital machine. "The architecture is holding Arthur," I whispered into the empty, darkened room. I turned back to my monitor, pulled up the master repository of Omnicore tech, and initiated the primary optimization routine. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, with practiced, flawless precision, compiling line after line of clean, unassailable code, patching the vulnerabilities and securing the perimeter for the new week ahead. The corporate raiders were gone. The system had been reclaimed. And as the midnight fog completely swallowed the San Francisco skyline outside my window, the golden copy of the empire began its long, quiet rebuild from the inside out.